Thank you so much, Edis. I was surprised, as you were, to be invited because I know so many more, so many other speakers who are so much more proficient than I am at giving public talks, and maybe some of those other times I might have to do referrals instead. But thank you so much, all the same, for the invitation. How long have we got? Just checking. Okay, we do, despite the lightning talks. Okay, wonderful. Hi, my name's Tom Christie. I've been working in open source development for the last 13 years or so, almost entirely full-time. I'm going to take this opportunity today to talk about historically some of the projects that I've worked on, to talk about the impact that those projects had, get maybe some feedback from you, the audience, regarding the impact, talk as well about the future as I see it of the work that I've been doing about one project in particular that I feel it has a lot of potential to be impactful in the Python ecosystem, and also talk about some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. So my journey in open source really started with Django and Django REST Framework. How many of you here in the audience have been users of Django REST Framework? Okay, right, so most of you, okay, wonderful. Django REST Framework started in 2011, and the core motivation was at this observation that we have all of these machine interfaces that we were able to interact with via tooling such as curl, and it seemed to me to be rather surprising that we weren't able to take these machine interfaces and interact with them through the medium of the web browser. Why were we not able to take the URLs that our APIs were exposing and put them straight into a web browser and interact with them directly through the browser? Now, because this was in 2011, this was before Swagger UI existed, or really there were any other tools like that. And having said that as well, Swagger UI is really slightly different concept, because that's saying, well, we're going to take a top-level description of an API service as a whole and expose that from a single URL. But the thing that I was trying to get at was, why can't we navigate through any of the URLs of our APIs that we're providing and be able to see the data and interact with the data through the browser? And I thought it was such an interesting concept, and it seemed to me to be genuinely valuable. I was like, oh, well, okay, I better demonstrate this by creating a project that does this. And that was REST Framework. This is it in one of its more recent incarnations. It was a bit more basic to begin with. And it kind of snowballed, because I was like, I think this is a really good idea. I'm really motivated by this. I would like other people to act on that as well. And the only way that I can see of doing that is to actually implement it and make it happen. Now, after I'd been working on that for a while, it started gaining in popularity, and it got to the point of figuring that it seemed valuable for me to be able to try and work on this full time. Now, there weren't lots of different avenues for people trying to do funded open source at the time. A Kickstarter was kind of one of the exceptions, so we ran a Kickstarter project in 2014. I had a really helpful employer at the time, so if any of you have Jamie Matthews on your radar, he was the lead developer that I was working with at a company that he helped found called Dab Apps, who they allowed me the time and space to set up a Kickstarter, and we've managed to figure out an agreement whereby I'd be able to work on open source full-time and run the Kickstarter and still be under the umbrella of the company, which was really wonderful and really helpful from them. Kickstarter's great, and I think it's probably still a really helpful option for a model if you have a project that you think's got legs that you want to try and secure some bulk set of funding for. But what it doesn't really work for is a sustainable model of funding, right? So you've got this, here's your one-off grants, but if you want to be able to have funding from a bunch of different companies and keep that going longer term, you need something else. So once the work on Kickstarter had been completed and there was still kind of clearly more stuff to do, I was like, well, okay, how are we going to deal with this? I got really lucky with the timing because Mozilla had just instituted a system of grants for open source projects. REST Framework managed to secure one of those grants, which gave me enough runway to then take a bit of a chance and set up a funding model for open source development. God bless Stripe, because they were, they suddenly made being able to get money from other people into your bank account be something that a regular developer could set up in only, I think there was like a 3-day project or something that I had to do to get the banner ads working on there. But what was that? Stripe and Heroku, and it's a shame Heroku's not what it once was, isn't it? Because what a wonderful, anyway. Sorry, shouldn't go off on those divergences. And had enough space and time then to set up a limited company trying to solicit funding from a whole bunch of different companies and individuals, and be able to focus fully on being completely invested on just building out REST framework. What have we got next? Oh yeah, okay, so, and that has been what has allowed the project to get where it is today. Now, there's things that we've done well, and there's things that have done less well during that. And there's also been times when you're taking funding and you're saying, well, I think this is what the roadmap is at the moment. Something that I think's been really beneficial about the model is that you have the freedom to be able to adapt as things go on. Maybe you try some experiments in one particular way, go, actually, that's not really what the direction that we do need to be going. We could do with steering over this way a little bit instead. Something I think that we've done a decent job on is a lot of the funding approaches that I've seen people take on seem to target individuals and ask for kind of very low rates of funding. My experience is that aiming almost entirely just at businesses for the funding routes and making sure that you're asking for sensible amounts in those tier rates. If you actually want to go full time and you're not just looking for coffee tips, then that's the route that you kind of got to go down. Oh yeah. Took until 2019 before GitHub sponsors landed and suddenly really kicked open the doors to people to be able to adopt these kinds of models with very low friction. So the core kind of reason why I'm going over this stuff historically is because I want to try to demonstrate the impact that the funding has. Without being able to focus fully on REST framework, having that funding model, we never would have been able to create that infrastructure that then a whole bunch of private companies can base their work on top of. And it's much more than just REST framework that the open source funding has managed to secure. So when we were working on REST Framework 3, for some reason it seemed like a good idea to, well, I was really appreciated Markdown, really appreciated working with Markdown, really wanted to use Markdown for the documentation, and there wasn't a decent option in Python for doing that at the time. So in the course of building out REST Framework, we also ended up building McDocs. Is this a project that many of you in the audience have used? Okay, yeah, a few, yeah. And one of the things that has then kind of piggybacked on top of that, so Martin Donath who's doing a really fantastic job and has a really good approach to open source funding that's worth checking out. Seems to have really got a good balance between managing to keep everything open source and transparent and public, but at the same time kind of have a slightly different avenue where he's got this slightly private space that has enough of a carrot to help him get funding from his contributors. So he's come up with the most popular theme for McDocs, which is McDocs material. Other work that the open source funding has secured. So one of the pitches we made with the funding for Django REST framework was we'd like to be able to work with WebSockets and work with the async concurrency model, which Andrew Godwin was doing a whole bunch of work with, bringing ASCII into Django. Now, that didn't actually quite go as planned, but it did go in a way that helped kickstart the ASCII ecosystem and help take ASCII from being something that Andrew Godwin had thought up that really just belonged in the land of Django to being a protocol that was adopted across a whole ecosystem. So one of the things we built was Unicorn, which is an ASCII web server. And then in order to help kickstart the growth of a web framework ecosystem on top of that, also the Starlet micro web framework, right? And there's now a kind of a proliferation of various different projects around this space. So for example, there's 3 different ASCII web servers that people can use. So there's the original reference implemented, well, reference probably isn't quite right, but Daphne from Andrew Godwin, Unicorn from Encode, and Hypercorn as well. Sorry, I've forgotten your name momentarily. And same for the web framework. So there's a whole bunch of different ASCII web frameworks that are available now, including Fast API. Is that something many people here are using at the moment? Okay, yeah, right, yeah. Fast API it uses Starlet as one of its core components. And the fact that Fast API exists relies on the work that was done in Unicorn and in Starlet. And one of the things that's really rewarding about that is being able to do a bunch of work that's instrumental in setting up a whole new ecosystem, and then having other fantastic people go and actually do a good job of building on top of that and not worry about having to be the lead on those sorts of things. And then the last project that I wanted to highlight is HTTPX, which is where I've been spending most of my time focused on lately. First of all, are many people in the audience using this at the moment? Oh, okay, yeah, quite a few. So HTTPX is an HTTP client for Python. It's more than just an HTTP client for Python. It's got a bunch of other things that I'll talk about. But here's the timeline of what we've delivered to date. The stuff that is there in the parentheses, that's work that we haven't done ourselves through Encode, but that has directly been done on top of the foundation that we've provided. And there's a whole proliferation of other projects as well based on that work, which I won't go into. So how many of you have used any of the tools mentioned in the talk so far? Almost everybody here. Okay, wonderful. Or, I mean, you're welcome, or I'm sorry, depending on the moment. Where are we going? Well, I'm going to talk about where it seems to me that my time is most valuable, where I've been focusing on most of the time recently, and my assessment of where I think that will continue to go. So, HTTPX. Why have I been motivated to put a whole huge chunk of time into building out an HTTP client for Python? And in particular, why have I been motivated to do that when there's already a really successful project in this space, requests? Yeah, I mean, this isn't the first time that I've reinvented a wheel. So HTTPX is an HTTP client that, let's start with, is broadly requests compatible. And when I say broadly request compatible, I mean that much of the top level API is synonymous. And it does everything that requests does. It fulfills all of the feature set that requests gives you. And also, now, the first thing that kind of prompted me into this, like many other flawed software developers, was, technical requirements. Technical requirements look important. Not sure that that's always quite the right angle to take on these things, but bringing HTTP2 support on top of requests or something requests-like was one of the primary motivators. And I was doing a bunch of work that was in an adjacent space, and it looked like something that was valuable to do. So HTTPX, it doesn't use HTTP2 by default, but you can enable it by just a configuration switch. And why do we take this approach? So actually, I think HTTP 1.1 is a better default for an HTTP client. The fact that it is that much simpler, and also while HTTP2 can bring performance benefits, it's not a given, right? And it's certainly not a given within the context of an HTTP client, because the performance characteristics that you have are not necessarily the same as you have with a browser. With a browser, you have particular style of interaction with the pages that almost always means HTTP is a performance improvement. When you're using a Python in particular HTTP client, HTTP2 may or may not bring performance benefits. So we have it defaulting to being off, but easy to switch on. So you have the ability to go, okay, well, actually, we're curious whether this is going to have a performance improvement for us. Let's just switch it on. Everything else is going to remain the same. We'll be able to analyze that within our actual existing live system and see whether we want to stick with that switch or not. A fantastic resource, I would say, if you want to understand HTTP2 better. The best place comes from the writing of Daniel Sternberg, the author of Curl. Has a really comprehensive site on this. Also on HTTP3 as well, actually. The other technical aspect that I wanted to address was having an HTTP client for Python with unified support for either regular threaded synchronous code or being able to use it within async contexts. There is already a really good async client available, AIO HTTP. But the benefit of having a client that has exactly or almost exactly the same interface for both the sync and the async variants, and having that within a single code base, being able to be maintained by a single team, and having the cognitive overhead of only having one set of tooling that you're thinking about, regardless of which context you're working within, seems to me to be tremendously valuable. So these are some brief examples of how our async support looks. And you can see it's just a switching of switching from the client to the async client and using the async and await keywords in places where we're suddenly being forced to be strictly typed about anywhere where I/O is being used. The async variant brings with it the benefit of typically being able to deliver much higher concurrency than the synchronous ones, as well as making it easier to reason about concurrent code. There's two different flavors of the async support that we have. We have support for async I/O, and we also have support for Trio. I'm a bit curious about this one. So how many people here use async I/O in their working lives? Right, okay. And of you lot, and how many of you know about or use Trio? Right, okay. That's interesting. So there's not that much awareness of Trio at the moment. Trio has been authored by Nathaniel J. Smith, and it is, so I'm not advocating that you should necessarily use this, but I will say it is an objectively more designed system than async I/O. Nathaniel had the set of really valuable insights around structured concurrency and had, wasn't working with the same constraints that the Python core team were, and has been able to deliver a concurrency library that really, really, really gets all the fundamental primitives of how these things should look right. There's a really good article that he's written about the fundamental stuff of structured concurrency that drove him to writing Trio, and that then has been adopted across a whole bunch of different languages, because the core insights that he was having there were about patterns rather than something that's linked to a particular language. If you're coming to a project fresh and you have the option of choosing either async I/O or Trio, it's really obviously ecosystem is a completely different trade-off, but really do take a look at Trio, because it gives you the right set of building blocks, whereas async I/O provides all of these primitives that really you don't want to know about. And it's just more joyful to work with. It's a really fantastic tool. Oh yeah, this is really fun. So we have, with HTTPX, we have a built-in command line client. And the command line client, it's a bit like, it's quite similar to either curl or HTTPI? And the command line client is a tool that you can use from the console that maps really cleanly onto the programmatic client that you might be using. So again, you've got this really low cognitive overhead of being able to switch between the two different things. You can be working in the console and then working within your Python code base. And there we are using using the tool to make a request from HTTP bin. I'll come back to some of the tools that help that we used in building that out. What else? Okay, so those were some of the features and technical requirements that were helping drive the motivation for working on this tool. Something that I felt was more fundamental was being able to have a really intentional design refresh of the HTTP client that went all the way through. So, hang on a moment. It must be so. We'll be getting there. Don't worry about it. Yeah. Anyway, so here's an example, right? So HTTPX is actually built up of a couple of different projects. It's composed of HTTP Core, which provides the fundamental low-level HTTP client, and then HTTPX on top, which provides the models and some of the redirect behavior, authentication, all of the kind of easy-to-use API, developer-friendly API that made requests really popular in the first place. And so here are the two different projects. We've got HTTPX providing the user interface that most developers are going to be working with day to day. But then sitting underneath that as one of the transport layers, as the default transport layer, is HTTP Core. And having a really clean design split between these these two aspects of the tooling is really beneficial. It means that when we're coming to debugging issues that people are having, it's really easy to isolate that into one particular place and be able to only have to think about one thing at a time. It makes it much more easy to understand for people coming to HTTPX as a learning resource, to learn and understand what's going on within that system. If you're coming to HTTP and Python and you want to understand a little bit more about the low-level mechanics of that, you can drop into HTTP Core and be able to focus just on one particular area without all the cognitive overhead of, wait a minute, do I need to think about any of this other code? Well, clearly not, no, because there's a nice clean design split between the two. And requests has a similar split because requests is built on top of URL lib3. But historically, the way that the two have been put together wasn't really how URL lib3 was intended to be used. And that means that there are certain aspects of API as you get down into slightly less used parts of API where you want to do something in a bit more detail. I'll come on to some examples a little bit later on where there isn't great public API around it, or where things don't fit together quite so cleanly, or where if you're looking at the code base as a learning resource, you're going to find it much more difficult to try to work your way through, well, wait a minute, what's actually going on here? So here's well, don't worry too much about the fact that you're not going to be able to read all of that. All the stuff that HTTPX provides is there on the left-hand side, and HTTP Core that's on the right. And HTTP Core has been designed to be the simplest possible API that we can provide for sending an HTTP request and getting an HTTP response. And HTTPX is everything else. Having that really clean design separation of concerns also means that we're able to plug into various other different transports. So of the transports that we provide, we have transports for being able to plug directly into either a WSGI or an ASGI application. So you can take the HTTPX client library, and rather than sending requests out over the network, plug them straight into your web framework and use it as your test client, for example. Other things, we've got a really simple mock transport implementation for if you just want to be able to write, okay, well, here's an httpx.request coming in. What's the httpx response that I want to return? And there's also the option of plugging in completely alternative network backends. So for example, there's absolutely no reason that HTTPX can't be used with URL lib3. Somebody has written a transport for this. It's slightly out of date. It could do with just a little bit more work getting that back up to speed. There's also other options. So for example, I think there's a wrapper in Python for libcurl. One of the things that somebody could provide if they were up for putting in just a little bit of work would be, here's a libcurl-based transport for HTTPX. So use the same client library, but have libcurl under the hood. A couple of different projects that are worth highlighting that we use in our implementation are H11 and H2. These are the libraries that we use for the HTTP parsing. And these are designed with the sans.io pattern, which means that then they're not making any kind of network requests at all. They're all pure code and pure functional code. Anyway. Means that they're very easy to reason about. Also means, maybe interestingly, that they'd be really easy to port to a different language. I think H11 in particular, I think it would be quite interesting to see somebody write a Rust-based alternative to that, say. Or it might be that maybe HTTP tools kind of fits a similar space already. I'm not sure. What's this? This is... So one thing that I find helpful about when you come to a project and it's got a really comprehensive test suite is I think that can be a good proxy onto helping you feel confident in the code quality. This is the test suite for HTTPX running. We've got 100% coverage of everything. We've got 100% coverage in the HTTP core as well. You can see that the test suite also runs really quite quickly, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a good indication that we've got our separation of design concerns right, so that when we're not actually having to make network requests or so on, that's not happening. What else? Careful timeouts throughout. So something that the requests that a big difference between requests is even just making a request to www.wherever.com could end up hanging indefinitely and just never return and type your thread indefinitely. Probably if you're, say, running within the context of a web framework, then maybe Gunnicorn's going to kill your request at some point. But otherwise, you're just never going to time out. You're just going to hang forever. HTTPX has default timeouts forever, so it will kill your request with a vengeance after 5 seconds if it hasn't been able to connect or if the data coming down the pipe stops. Type annotated throughout, and a bunch of sharper constraints than some places you'll find in requests. I think there's still a bit more work to be doing that can be done here, but there's some places where that old really kind of sketchy model of Python of, oh, well, just throw this thing into this function and we'll coerce it if it's not quite what we expected. I'm sure it'll be fine. With HTTPX, it's more kind of strictly typed all the way through. I think particularly in terms of when you're posting data up, there's so much scope within requests at the moment to throw a data structure into that and not necessarily get the behavior that you expect happening. Also, so the request and the response models have been designed in a way that they're suitable for either working with as a client or working with on the server side. Now, this isn't something that I've explored very much at the moment, but I think is interesting is there's certainly scope for HTTPX to also have a few extra additions that would make it suitable for use either as a client or as a micro framework. That might be valuable if one of the things that you value is having really minimal amount of dependencies within your project and introducing as little as possible into the projects that you're working with. I think there's a little bit of a danger there of it going kind of off the rails, or not off the rails, but not being as clearly focused as it would otherwise be. To me personally, I think it's attractive though. And a whole bunch of other stuff. So because we've been able to have the time and the space to work on this and address the comprehensive design refresh all the way through, there's a whole bunch of lower level stuff that you're able to do with HTTPX that either you're able to do cleanly through the public API, or in a few areas there are some things where we can say, well, we're not quite there yet, but we can show you a really clean, clear roadmap for how we can get there. So examples of things, right? The public API for HTTPX gives you everything that you need to do the fundamentals for setting up a WebSocket connection. And then you can take a package such as WS Proto and build the WebSocket back and forth on top of that. But the WebSocket setup can be done with HTTPX, so using the same authentication, for example, that you'd be using elsewhere. You can get information about the state of the connection pool, so how many active connections have I got, how many idle connections have I got that are open to a server that don't currently have requests going out on them, how many of my connections are HTTP 1, how many are HTTP 2. You can there's public API for getting back the SSL context that you're working with. There's some really in-depth trace support that you can use, which give you all sorts of information about the timing characteristics for the DNS setup, the SSL setup, whether you're waiting on the connection pool if you're heavily utilized, and or being able to inspect exactly the traffic that's coming back through HTTP 2. We have or use the SSL context to enforce SSL fingerprinting. So for example, if you want to really have a lot of security around a system that you're connecting to, you can use the public API and go, okay, I know what the server was saying at this point in time. I'm really going to lock that server right in. They are going to, unless they're delivering me exactly what they said they were, it's a no-go. And then we've got some of the things that aren't quite there, but we have a really clear roadmap towards being able to deliver. So HTTP 2 has the ability to be used as a bidirectional stream. It's similar to WebSockets. Building a gRPC client on top of HTTPX. We've got pretty much all the fundamentals there of being able to do that. I kind of find that interesting because actually gRPC isn't really, I mean, it calls itself a protocol, but really it's a tool suite at this point in time. I just haven't seen many other implementations on top of it, which is what you would normally expect from a protocol, and it's not, it's a tool suite. Whether that's got a lot of value in it, I don't know. Maybe it's more of a hobby project. We'll probably look at, I can see a clear, let me say that differently. I can see a clear roadmap for how we'll be able to provide developers with the ability to add different DNS policies. We'll probably put some DNS caching in place as well, at least as an option. And we also have, there is an outstanding pull request for HTTP3 support. HTTP3 is a bit of a difficult one. I think it's very unlikely to bring performance benefits in Python. If anything, it's probably a net negative. I think it could be valuable as a debugging tool within Python, but I don't think it's a default that anybody should be reaching for if performance is their concern. And the complexity is yet again more as well. I talked in a talk not that long ago about HTTP2 saying, well, HTTP is actually a PSYOP designed to attract the developers with overly technical minds into foolish paths, whilst the more creative people can get on with, 1.1 was fine, and let's go and do fun stuff instead. But and the complexity that HTTP3 brings on top again is, I feel that it brings with it the opportunity for security issues, and well, just the comprehensibility is that much more difficult. Oh yeah. So why do I also think this is all this work is particularly relevant at the moment? So the current primary maintainer on requests, who's also been working with the project for the longest amount of time, I can't remember, but so Ian Stapleton Cordas, have I got that? Anyway, he's recently issued this blog post around where he feels the project is at the moment and why he feels like the project is kind of dead in the water right now. And these are the key things that I wanted to deliver from what he's said about the project is the project feels dead and hard to introduce new, necessary, and beneficial features, hard to fix gnarly bugs, and hard to improve the user experience, right? And HTTPX is in a position to deliver on all of those things, so long as, so long as we do a decent job of managing to work together with everybody in the community as well, of course, and be placed in the right position. So, okay, there we are. That's HTTPX. I include this shot of the Pompidou Center just because I feel like there's something similar about the design sensibilities that the two have, that trying to open up the internals, make it really easy to inspect what is actually going on, be able to provide developers and people learning Python with that ability to kind of just step straight into different parts of the code base and have their hand held a little bit and guided out, well, wait a minute, how does this system fit together? These are some of the things that I talk about if I wanted to just kind of condense the design sensibility. So I'll start at the ground floor on this one. Design coherence all the way through. So even as you're coming into less commonly used technical aspects of the tool, that's still having a similar design to the APIs that applies all the way through the project. Layered design, so being able to isolate particular sections and have low cognitive overhead when you're working on it. And an overall low complexity stack. So not having a whole bunch of submerged complexity through a whole bunch of dependencies, but having everything nice and clear and on the surface. Some hows, we've got the command line client, some of the tooling that we've used to help deliver that that's worth highlighting. So from the palettes team, fantastic, of course, unsurprisingly. Their command line tooling Click we use for the command line clients. I think that's a really lovely little tool. I mean, if in doubt, ask Armin is also decent advice. You know, what else have we got? Oh, Will McGugan has been working on a bunch of really interesting stuff in the console. We only use a tiny slice of what he's been working on, which is one of the packages, which is Rich, which we use for the code formatting and highlighting on the command line tool. He's also doing a whole bunch of incredibly interesting and geeky and fantastic stuff in the command line. If you're interested in building command line applications, you should go and check out what they're doing, because the demos are just awesome and they're just really fun, and I think they probably appeal to quite a lot of us here in the audience, because they just have that slightly like retro feel, and it's a lot of fun. For the sync and async supports, just a brief kind of overview of how that's delivered. So the central kind of idea of how would you go about having a project that delivers both an async code base and a synchronous code base came from the URL lib3 team, who suggested a really smart approach of let's just mirror from one to the other. Now, essentially with an asynchronous code base, what you have is you have some typing, some additional typing that's in place that forces you to strictly type anytime I/O is being used. So the approach that we use in HTTP core for being able to provide both an async and a sync variant is we have the canonical code base, which is the asynchronous one, and then that is then automatically mirrored into the synchronous one by just stripping out some of the async and await keywords and a few of the other little bits of syntax that are slightly different between the two. So here's an example of the two different bits of code, and you can see that the code is just being mirrored pretty much, but there's just a few little almost cosmetic changes in place, which just remove the, that strict I/O typing on there, which is just had its corners rounded out. If you're looking to do something similar with a project that you're working on, there is a tool available packaged up in PyPI that you can use, which is the unasync. Does the same thing. Anyway, yeah, so what did I want to say? So funding open source really can work, right? I think that these projects seem to have had a tremendous impact on the ecosystem. The pitch that I always used to make to businesses of, why would like, this stuff is free. Why would we fund it? Why would we be interested in doing that? That's ridiculous. How about you pay our company, what I always used to pitch was, how about you fund our company $100 a month and I work for you full time? And that seemed to me to be just such an attractive value proposition of, why would these businesses possibly say no to that? Going to be working on stuff that your business uses and, be working on full time. Ideally, also working with other people who are funded full time as well. We've never really quite managed to hit those milestones. We've had like a little bit of being able to start to fund other developers. I'm probably not a good enough marketer yet to have managed to hit that lift-off point. Maybe, who knows, with a bit more community support and the right people in place, that might happen. Or, you know, it may be I'm currently working with Octopus at the moment. They've been really supportive so far. It might be that I'm able to transition into Encode being a kind of a managing body and I no longer take any income from Encode. Kind of remains to be seen. Nice to be able to have those conversations out in the public, though. Some learnings that I've made along the way. One thing at a time. So certainly when it comes to issues and conversations in issues and pull requests, I think if you're able to maintain a really clear focus on what is being discussed, it's really easy to accidentally introduce into your conversations around the code, accidentally put too many different things onto the table, and suddenly the conversation's being completely derailed. If you want it to really track neatly, stick with, okay, I've heard what this person's saying, I'm going to try to deliver my response in a way that pretty much keeps something on track. And, you know, maybe there's a little aside as well, but, you know, try to make sure that the conversations are being steered really cleanly. I I looked for an animation, like, just as I was sitting earlier having a look at the talk. I was like, can I animate a strike through on this one? Tried to drop the ego. Not sure that's actually quite true. I think I would probably rephrase it as be transparent and open to working in the round. Actually, you know, having an ego is quite useful because otherwise how on earth are you going to be voicing, no, this is what I really think is sensible. The flip is, you know, really being able to step back from that as well and try to ensure that the outcomes that you are seeking are not directed at what is best for me, what is best for the community as a whole. As I say, there's a counterbalance, which is don't lose your voice in the process of doing that. Hold yourself accountable. So let's take a simple example, but in the context of pull requests. Make sure that you're working by the same set of guidelines that you'd expect other people to being held up against too, and make sure that you, whatever policies and procedures you put in place, even as a project maintainer, that you're not stepping over those same set of guardrails, and that you're following the same constraints as everyone else in the team. It doesn't mean that there can't be different tiers for different roles within the project, but having one individual be allowed to be dictatorial in, oh, yep, that's going in, is not a healthy way for things to work. I think workflow is really important, so something that trying to pitch on our projects is being really consistent with the workflow for how code changes come into being. So it's really easy as a developer to end up focusing on code for the sake of code. I think having a really consistent workflow where you force discussion to be the primary starting place and to then only escalate from a discussion into an issue once the maintainership have gone, yes, okay, this is actually worth working on, and then to only issue your pull request at the point where the maintainership and the team as a whole have all agreed that this is a code change that ought to be in place. Just having that consistency, I feel, really helps keep everything sharp, nice and sharp. Default to no. I mean, you see with projects all the time, it is so easy to allow the various voices that are coming from the outside world to go, oh, well, maybe a little change here, maybe a little prod there, maybe a little something here. And unless the maintainership team are really all on the same boat about being able to say, we welcome your contribution. No. It's so hard to find the right phrasing for it, right? And it's something I've been trying to figure out in terms of life advice as well. I think it's a really, what was it? Somewhere about, yeah, you can come and ask me about it separately if you like, and I will actually tell you. But for a while I was like, oh, you know what? I'm just going to say yes to everything. That sounds like a really good advice, and that was interesting. And then I was like, no, wait a minute. I'm going to say no to almost everything. That sounds like much better advice. I sidetracked into life advice there. That wasn't really what I was intending. Docs first is a really sound approach to a lot of things, I think. You see tests first advocated plenty. I haven't seen docs first advocated much. I don't really understand why, because being able to clearly talk about what it is you want to be different, not here are the code changes I want to make, not here's how I want to go about implementing this, but being able to clearly say, this looks like this at the moment. Here's how I'd like things to look differently. Here's how I would like things to work differently. And I'm able to describe that in a way that is at the level of the docs rather than at the level of the code changes. Seems to me to be a really smart approach. Keep it simple. What am I talking about there? A few different cases where that can apply. So that might be within the remit of pull requests, being able to make sure that when you're issuing pull requests that you're not accidentally bundling up a whole bunch of different thick concerns into one, but you're neatly targeting something as succinctly as possible. But also especially if you're contributing to a project in terms of the issues that you're raising. Before you're bringing something to the table and asking for somebody's time, really make sure that you've put in the effort to narrow down exactly what you think is happening, why you think it should be different, and that you can demonstrate you've put in the issue. You can demonstrate to the person whose time you're asking of that you have put in the time to fully understanding what is going on, and you've narrowed it right down to, and I can't go any further than this. So, for example, if you're raising an issue with a project, try to avoid, well, I'm using this web framework, and I think there's an issue in this web server here. It's like, no, you're almost certainly capable of stepping through the different layers and isolating one particular segment where you think there's an issue. If, the more you're able to do that, the more of my time or the team that I'm working together with, of our time, that will be able to then deliver to you in kind. And, yeah. I don't know how we've done for time, but that looks like me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. This was awesome. I think we can have one or two questions for the wide audience, and then we can go back there and we can have some drinks and hang around, because we have this reception going on. So 2, 1, 2, 3, okay? And then we move back there, please. And can you repeat the question after?
Okay.
Thanks, Tom. I didn't understand if when you keep the synchronous and asynchronous code in the HTTP core, if the process of an asyncing the code is fully autonomous, or if there's some hand tweaking.
So the question was, is the async to sync process fully automated, or is there some bits of having to do stuff by hand? The answer is yes, it's fully automated. The one thing that is slightly different is actually we only use that process within HTTP core. At the moment within HTTPX, because there are very few places where HTTPX actually uses async, we're just doing pull requests by hand in that particular project. We could use unasync there as well. There is a pull request to switch it over to do that. It's not clear to me whether the trade-off in terms of the shift around in code that delivers is worth it. But yes, it's fully automated. Yeah.
I have a question about funding motivation.
Yeah.
What services do you or people like PyCon offer as a carrot to your sponsor businesses?
Okay.
Ads or feature requests or prioritizing their feature requests? What motivates them?
Okay, so the question was about funding and what carrots do we offer to businesses to motivate them to fund the projects. So Martin is doing a much better job of this than I am, because Martin offers really sensible carrots, like here's our insiders program. So there are a bunch of different features within McDoc's material that are only available to paid subscribers, but he's just got that cut-off right. You know, almost all of the stuff is open, but there's these nice few frills that are available that wouldn't otherwise be available unless you're paying to be part of the insiders program. And he also has I think there's a really good discussion space that's open within insiders, that you're not getting those discussions unless you're paying to be part of the community. And I think they also get like pre-releases available where the freebies ain't going to get those pre-releases. They will get them in time. What do we offer? Well, I have a slightly different approach to this, which may need to be mediated somewhat. I would rather like to be able to offer a few different tier rates where we've got, say, the $100 a month, and we've got the $500 a month, and we've got the $1,000 a month, and to be able to say, you're going to help fund us working on your core infrastructure, and the carrot is, look within. Now, that doesn't necessarily fly as removing potential blockers to marketing departments. Yeah. I think you do need to be really careful about the framing though, right? Because something that can happen if you're offering carrots to these companies is you're setting a framing where it looks like the carrots are the thing that's being paid for. Right? Really, what you want to be making really clear is you are helping deliver the core infrastructure that your company depends on. You're not paying for the little ads that show that you're a well-behaving open source citizen. You are paying for the security and peace of mind that the core infrastructure that you are working on is going to be there, is going to be well funded. And yes, you're demonstrating publicly that you're doing that, but you're demonstrating that publicly so that you're enabling other companies to also step up to that mark so that we can all watch each other and all see each other and all keep each other honest, that we're all pitching in a little bit and we're all pitching in a little bit of enough to make the whole gig work. Yes?
I'm an idealist and I would love to see that happen. Do you think that like, without the ability to hold that value hostage against people, like, because the work that do you see a successful way forward, I guess, without that ability to hold something back for people who are paying?
Not sure is the answer. Evidently, social changes do occur, right? And I think with the right marketing and sufficiently clear and capable delivery of that message, then yes, it seems to me that there's space for somewhat of a change there to be possible. I would say, if I were going to argue against my case, businesses like Sentry, they've been spectacularly successful, and they've gone for, well, is it the open core or whatever it is? They've kind of shown, look, if you want to be a badass in the badass business world, here's the few extra little protections that you need to put in place. And I think Martin, in a way, is doing something similar but at a smaller scale. But it does seem to me to be a valid, one of the valid approaches. Maybe it's not something that scales up to being mega business, but I mean, it works for Wikipedia, right? Or whether it works or not, it feels a little bit limpy how they're having to keep asking, oh, please donate to us. So I think there's something there about the marketing and the delivery. Also, it clearly needs a whole community to be able to be getting this stuff right, because I can see for myself, like, here are my weak spots. Here are the things I'm not able to do that. If we really want to be able to concretize that as a legitimate approach to, at the very least, not maybe massively huge companies, but sustainable and secure and foundationally important businesses, yeah, I don't see why not. Yeah, sure, over here. And then here. So I think the question was, what do I think of businesses where they are open sourced and stakeholder owned?
The Hall of Fame Foundation is the example. The foundation is owning the trademark. It's not the source code, it's open source, but the logos and all the stuff is owned by them. And they have members, which are companies, and they pay fees. And in exchange for these membership fees and membership, they can vote on what to spend these funds on.
I'm probably not the right person to ask that, because my answer would just be, I don't know, that's not quite what I'm doing, and I don't know, it sounds very clipboardy. So I'm like, yeah, but I want something that feels more dynamic than that. But don't ask me that, because I didn't say that, because I don't want to be, having opinions about it. Have we got time for this question over here or not?
Very quick one.
Yeah, it's a quick one. Maybe a bit complicated to answer.
Oh, shall we do it late? Shall we ask it later then and let everyone shoot off? What do you think?
It's very simple, to be fair. So what open source license do you prefer and what works best? Maybe a bit hard to answer straight away.
And answer.
Okay, I go for MIT because it's nice and simple. I would prefer to go with something a little bit more to the legal teams, but I don't.
So the last one I wanted to ask was, maybe related to this question, what kind of accountability is expected from the fund providers?
What kind of accountabilities provide? Well, when we're doing a job well, transparency and decent reports onto what we're doing. When we're doing the job mediocrely, just the work that is happening. Currently we're doing that mediocrely, so just, the stuff that I've shown you. Thank you very much, everybody.